Hey folks, Mark Scroggins.
And John Withers.
Hey, we are back for another episode of Family Law Talk. John, I wanted to talk, we've talked a little bit, well, we talk all the time about family violence issues.
Comes up all the time.
Yeah. So there is a certain term I'm going to use, an affirmative finding of family violence.
Okay.
Okay. Can you tell everybody what we're talking about when we say that?
Sure. So, as you know, I do criminal law and
Right.
family law, board certified criminal law specialist as well as a family law specialist. And so you see affirmative findings of family violence come up in both contexts, both in the criminal and the family. So what I thought we ought to do is talk about the criminal aspects first, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, that's good.
And then we can talk about how it applies in the family context, because I think that's going to be of most interest to our viewers. But for criminal aspects, an affirmative finding is like a tag.
Okay.
It's a tag that the judge puts on the judgment. The judgment is the final order of the court in the legal matter, and if the judge finds that the offense involved the use of family violence,
Right.
the judge can put that tag on the judgment.
And just for clarification purposes, this is typically you're going to see this in a marital situation or a dating relationship, right?
Right. For it to constitute family violence,
Right.
it has to be a family member or a member of the household, or in a dating relationship.
Right.
A family member, you don't have to actually be related to be
Right.
considered part of the family.
Right.
If you have children together, even if you're not married, you're a member of the family.
Exactly.
So when we talk about family violence, it encompasses a bunch of different relationships that people can have.
Right.
But basically, if you're a family member or a member of the household or in a dating relationship, you can be subject to this tag on your judgment. And there's certain collateral consequences. By collateral, I mean consequences beyond just the lawsuit that's pending. There are consequences down the road that can be associated with this affirmative finding.
And so when we're talking about that in a criminal context, it's like somebody's found guilty of an assault.
Right.
Okay. And so if they're found guilty of an assault with family violence, so it's got that affirmative finding, that tag that you were just talking about.
Right.
What does that do?
So there are several consequences or collateral in addition to the lawsuit of a finding of family violence. One is it can affect the punishment range. So let's say you get in a barroom fight and you assault somebody.
Yep.
All right. That's called an assault.
Right.
All right. So your punishment range is one thing. If it's a family member that you assault, your punishment range can be enhanced. It can be higher because it's a family member. So that's one consequence.
Okay.
Another is if you're convicted of an offense involving family violence or even placed on probation for an offense involving family violence, any subsequent allegation of family violence can be enhanced to a felony automatically. So it can go from what we call a Class C misdemeanor, which is like a traffic ticket, an offensive touching, let's say.
Right.
If you touch a family member offensively in an offensive way, and that affirmative finding is placed on your judgment, any subsequent allegation of family violence, no matter how slight, automatically jumps to a felony.
Wow.
The third, another consequence though is the criminal court can make certain injunctive type orders. An injunction is an order that prohibits somebody from doing something.
Right.
So the criminal judge can make these injunctive type prohibitions to prevent somebody from doing things that you typically would see in a family law context. You can also see it in a criminal context.
So from a practical standpoint, that can cause all kinds of hardships on the family.
Exactly, and we see it every day, and I'm starting to see it more and more. And I can't help but think it's COVID.
Right.
But I'm getting more and more calls from people who are accused of offenses involving family violence, or are facing family protective orders because of allegations of family violence. It seems to be more and more common these days.
Well, and we talked about that in a previous podcast, but let's talk about a little bit, what are the consequences if you've got an affirmative finding of family violence in a family law context?
Well, so in my opinion, the law incentivizes people to make these allegations when ordinarily they might not, because there are huge consequences in a family law context.
Right.
So if you're just talking about a divorce, let's say we're not even talking about kids.
Right.
If there's an allegation of family violence and let's say it's proved, then the victim can claim a disproportionate share of the community estate. In other words, the court can consider that in how the court divides the community property. And
Right.
you can get a lopsided division if there's an affirmative finding. Another is post-divorce spousal maintenance, or some people like to call alimony.
Right.
Right? So in Texas, you typically have to be married to your spouse a certain number of years before you're eligible,
Right.
unless there's affirmative finding of family violence.
Exactly.
Suddenly then a person who might not otherwise be eligible for alimony becomes eligible.
Right. And it's not a rehabilitation statute anymore. That's
No,
punitive. I mean,
it
so they're
is.
trying to punish you if in that situation as compared to before where it's trying to get that person up on their feet.
Well, and I guess I suppose the rationale there is that if a person has to get out of a marriage because of family violence, if you shouldn't have to be married to a person 10 years or more to be
Right.
be eligible. So
Yeah.
I think that's the rationale. But another consequence in a divorce situation is these protective orders.
Right.
These protective orders are the nuclear bomb of family law.
Yep.
Because the judge can order somebody not only to stay away from somebody, but to stay 500 yards from somebody, or their place of business, or their child's school, or their child's daycare. It's I don't want to say draconian. That's probably an overstatement, but it's huge.
Yeah, it
because
is.
your movement can be affected. You can't ever possess a firearm if you're under a protective order.
Right.
And so if you're a hunter or anything like that, or even a collector, I had a client one time who was a collector. He had to get rid of all of his guns because he was under a protective order.
Right.
So then you also have the consequence of a suit for damages. That's like a car wreck case.
Right.
You could have a car wreck case or a suit like a car wreck case where your spouse is claiming money damages against you in the context of a divorce.
Right.
So that's another potential consequence.
What about, and folks have heard me talk about a lot of stuff with child custody. So child custody, you got two different pieces. You've got conservatorship, which are the rights and duties really around child rearing decisions. And then you have possession and access. How does it affect conservatorship?
And this, in my opinion, is the biggest hammer when there's allegations of family violence, because in a divorce situation you're talking about stuff, but here you're talking about children.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is huge. So the family code requires the court to inquire about family violence.
Right.
It's required.
Right.
And so, if the court finds that there's been family violence, then all sorts of things kick in. For instance, as you know, and I'm sure you've discussed on other podcasts, there's a presumption in favor of joint managing conservatorship, or some people like to call it joint custody.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
We don't have custody in Texas, but we know what that kind of means. Right.
Yep.
So there's a presumption in favor. So absent a finding of family violence, generally speaking, you're looking at joint custody.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
If there's a finding of family violence, that is off the table. The court is prohibited from granting joint custody. Okay.
Yeah.
Now let's say the person who's accused of family violence is the better parent.
Yep.
Guess what? It may mean that he can't be the sole custody.
Right.
And I use he, it could be she,
Right.
but the judge has to make certain findings that to overcome the presumption against the perpetrator, let's say,
Right.
being the sole managing conservator. Then, if the judge finds it, the court has to put certain protective measures in place
Right.
to include supervision of all access to that child.
Right.
And
Yeah.
that's huge.
Right.
Because if you think about it, that means that somebody who's approved by the court has to be present at every single period of possession.
Right. So I think the big takeaway on these for everybody is that, oh my gosh, that's something to really be concerned about.
It is on both sides. Now, if there's family violence, obviously,
Right.
it needs to be brought up, and it needs to be prosecuted vigorously.
Exactly.
Because and I don't mean to make light of it. I think we need to be serious about this, because there are people in relationships who are battered, and they are captive in those relationships, and this may be their only way out.
Absolutely.
And there are dangerous people out there.
No question. And I mean, that's, I have prosecuted a lot of these things in my time, and and I think it is something. It is an excellent tool that needs to be used when someone, has been subject to violence.
Exactly.
Okay. Unfortunately, there are also in this day and age, there are times where people make shit up for lack of
They're willing to exploit it.
Yeah.
And there are lawyers who are willing to exploit it.
And that's the thing. I think lawyers have a duty to, if somebody is tells you that they have been abused by their spouse, then I think that lawyer has a duty to investigate.
I agree. I completely agree.
And there's sometimes, if you find yourself in that situation, by all means, you should file for a protective order, and and odds are that you're going to get it.
Right.
However, there are other lawyers out there that are looking to try to make something
they seek it out.
Yeah, exactly.
They seek it out because there are such advantages that can be had with these findings that it really makes the playing field lopsided.
Right.
And it's hard to overcome.
It is.
And there's a stigma associated with it. And we didn't talk about this, but it's not part of the law. But we know the NFL, for instance, suspends players who are accused of family violence.
Right.
So there are other private employers who will fire employees who've been accused or certainly convicted or found guilty of family violence. So there's all kinds of consequences.
So that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about. So my understanding is it can have an affirmative finding of family violence can have effect on professional licenses.
Absolutely. And each profession is different on how they look at it.
Right.
But I represented a medical doctor here recently, and he was very concerned about the consequences it could have to his future employment.
Right.
And it could mean tens of thousands of dollars.
Right.
So it is a big deal.
Yeah. So we're not just talking about losing a fishing license.
Exactly.
So
if you think you're the victim of family violence and you need a zealous prosecution of that case, you need to consider Scroggins Law Group.
Yeah.
And if you think you've been wrongfully accused of family violence,
right,
you need to hire Scroggins Law Group.
Well, I totally agree, and that's one of the things, folks, I'm super excited about is with having John on board. So, who is not only board certified in family law, as am I, but he's got board certification in criminal law and years of experience as a prosecutor. So, he has a very particular skill set that is not common within the
there's an overlap
field.
there, and I feel like I have the background because of this overlap, and maybe that's why I'm seeing more of these claims. I don't know. Maybe people are seeking me out. Who knows? But
right.
I'm just saying, if you need help prosecuting one of these cases, we can help you. If you need to defend yourself on one of these cases, we can help you with that too.
And I appreciate you saying that. I want to talk about one other thing before we go here. And those are a couple of helpful hints, okay? So what advice would you give to a man or woman who has been subjected to violence by a partner? What would you tell them if someone calls you and says, John, so-and-so is whipping my ass. What do I need to do?
Call the police and get out.
Okay.
And here's the thing. There are lawyers out there that say don't leave because if you leave, the judge will assume that means you're okay with leaving, and that judge might keep you out of the house. And that's true. That's possible. But more likely, if the judge senses that you got out because of your personal safety, I don't think the judge is going to hold it against you. So I tell my clients, don't do anything unsafe. If your safety is on the line, you need to get out. You need to protect your personal safety. We'll worry about the other stuff later. Right. So that's number one.
If you have someone who calls you and says that I am concerned based on the statements that are being made by my spouse, and I'm concerned that he or she is going to make false allegations, what do you tell them then?
Get out.
Exactly.
Get out.
Get the hell out.
Right.
And anytime you're around that person, have someone with you.
Oh, absolutely. You need to get out. And if that means the judge kicks you out and you don't have access to the house, whatever, because if you're accused of this, if you're actually accused of this in a criminal setting or a family law setting,
Right.
it's way worse than having to stay in a hotel or an apartment.
Absolutely.
Get out.
So be safe. That goes on both sides.
On both sides.
And if you've got to, get the hell out and make sure that you surround yourself with people that you can trust and you know that you are safe with.
Absolutely. And if your spouse is acting aggressive or whatever, get out.
Yeah, exactly.
Get out.
The rest of this is just stuff, and it can be sorted out.
Right.
You know, putting yourself in a really dangerous situation, it can escalate quickly, and emotions get the better of people, and then it's something you read about in the paper.
Absolutely. And we don't want that to happen.
Exactly. John, thanks for the time today.
Thanks for having me.
Folks, thank you. Appreciate it. You can always get us at info@Scroggins Law Group or call the office, 214-469-3100. John's heading up our Dallas office. I'm in Frisco. We got tons of folks that can help you out. Let us know. We're here to help.